I'm John DiLiberto, and you're hearing the Echoes podcast from PRX. I hadn't realized it had been so long, 8 weeks, since our last podcast release. I hope you didn't forget us because we're revving up for a new season. In upcoming weeks, I've got the trio of Will Ackerman, Jeff Oster, and Tom Eaton, and we'll be hearing from Stefan Mikas. But we're going to start with Chronotope Project. That's Jeffrey Allen Erickson, and he's been making philosophy-infused ambient music for most of this century. His latest album, Gnosis, is the Echoes CD of the month for September. And why don't we just get right into it as we travel through the Hadron Collider and Greek philosophy with Chronotope Project. Chronotope Project is the performance name of Jeffrey Erickson Allen. He's a trained cellist who is more likely to play electronic instruments like the Haken Continuum and the Harpagee electronic zither. He creates a music bound in string theory, Buddhism, Japanese poetry, space music, and, on his latest album, Gnosis, Greek philosophy. He creates his music from his home in Eugene, Oregon, and that's where he was sitting when I spoke to him in 2015 and again in 2021. Jeffrey Erickson Allen seems an unlikely person to be an electronic musician. He's played cello since he was a child. He was a librarian, and he doesn't own a cell phone. But perhaps the most unusual thing about Allen, at least for an instrumental electronic artist, is that he was a storyteller.
One very cold and snowy day, wily and crafty Coyote passed through the people's village. The people drew all about him. "Coyote, you have taught us so many things. How to make fish traps and how to spear salmon, how to dry the fish and store it for the winter," they said.
I spoke to Jeffrey Allen on the phone in 2015, but I talked to him again on Zoom for some of this interview. He's in his home in Eugene, Oregon. As you'll hear, he sounds professorial, and he looks that way, with horn-rimmed glasses and short-cropped gray hair and goatee and mustache combo. Behind him is a portrait of Buddha, and off to his right shoulder are various flutes and recorders. Jeffrey Erickson Allen doesn't tell verbal tales as much anymore, but he thinks he's still a storyteller.
I'm a storyteller through the musical realm now, and particularly this new album, I think really epitomizes that. There are a lot of mythological and literary sources for it. What I'm always trying to get to is, the kernel of the story, the inner truth behind, the outer story. And music is a particularly intimate way to do that. It's a way of telling the story without being too concerned about externals. So I'm still a storyteller, just have a different medium now.
Jeffrey Erickson Allen's story began in Los Angeles, where he was born in 1958. He came into a musical family and was taught cello by his grandfather.
There was always music playing in the home. In fact, when I was a child, I really loved the idea of maybe being a conductor. So I even set up a podium, and I got scores, and my grandfather taught me how all the different ways to beat different rhythms. I would cue in the instruments and just imagine that I was evoking all this sound.
Allen played in classical ensembles and orchestras, and for 20 years he had a modern chamber group called Confluence, who put out several recordings around the turn of the millennium.
I was heavily involved with new acoustic music before I adopted Chronotope Project. I had a group called Confluence. The guitarist Forrest McDowell and I were the core of that. We wrote all the pieces, and I did all the arranging and recording for that group. We had, at various times, tabla, flute, harp, another cellist, and it was a great adventure.
Somewhere along the way, the electronic switch got flipped.
I was a listener of programs like Hearts of Space. I would probably say that Brian Eno was my first introduction to ambient music. I think, the music for airports was probably my first exposure.
Alan recorded his first electronic album, Vanish into Blue, in 1992 under the name Jeff Defty. It's as Chronotope Project that Alan emerged with his own sound. It embraces not only his musical interests, but his philosophical, spiritual, and scientific ones as well.
I find that contemplating cosmological ideas, either through physics or astronomy, kind of takes me out of a small world and into a very large universe. So I think about it a lot, and of course it makes its way into my music. And probably, I would say, ambient music is a home for a lot of kind of cosmological ideas. It naturally evokes that. The atmospheric pads, the long reverbs and delays, they all seem to suggest wide open space.
Chronotope Project's 2015 album, Dawn Treader, was a recording of long-form compositions, some of which create a floating stasis in space, others which go on journeys. Many of them abound around his studies in science and Buddhism, beginning with his performance name.
Chronotope Project is derived from a very seminal idea of the literary critic and philologist Mikhail Bakhtin. He was looking for a language to describe the confluence of space and time as it appears primarily in literature. And so Bakhtin decided to take two Greek words, so chronos, meaning time, and topos, meaning space, and put them together to create the word chronotope. I thought it was just an ideal description for what I'm doing as a musician.
Alan continues mixing philosophy and music on his 2021 album, Gnosis.
Gnosis is one of many Greek words for knowledge, being the highest form of knowledge, representing embodied wisdom or spiritual knowledge.
He transforms those concepts into music like the opening track of Gnosis. It's called Higgsfield Cauldron of Being. In Alan's mind, it merges Greek philosophy with physics.
The very first track is a reflection on the nature of being. My reflection on this is one that takes us from out of Greek philosophy, in a sense, to modern physics. Because, the very ancient pre-Socratic philosophers like Thales were exploring what they called physis, which is the root of physics. They wanted to ask the question, where did this come from? So Thales, for example, said, well, the primary element must be something like water. It's something diffuse, and it's something that's kind of all-encompassing. And interestingly enough, the particle accelerator at CERN, where Peter Higgs' theory was vindicated, is a water-cooled tube. So that piece, which begins the album, begins with this amorphous, watery texture, and gradually coalesces as it accumulates rhythmic elements and a great crescendo into the beginning of being itself.
You can still find Jeffrey Erickson Allen playing his cello in classical settings, and it even turns up on Gnosis. But with Chronotope Project, he gets to explore a world in between. You can hear that on Gnosis when he plays the Haken Continuum.
Oh, the Haken Fingerboard Continuum is a remarkable synthesizer. Lippold Haken, who is at the University of Indiana in both computer science and music departments, wanted to create a more expressive kind of controller for electronic music. And he came up with this instrument which has a soft neoprene surface, playing surface, and it's continuous. It's, instead of having discrete keys, it's a little bit more like a stringed instrument. So it enables you to do wonderful bends, to do alternate intonation, and for a cellist, it's a perfect instrument. So I've really fallen in love with it, and I use it quite extensively.
His spiritual beliefs are just as influential as his scientific and philosophical explorations.
Yes. I've been a student of Buddhism for 30-odd years. And while I would say that I'm actually fairly soft on a lot of the metaphysical beliefs, the practice is very important to me and very grounding to me. And the iconography of Buddhism, there's really a profound system of symbology for all kinds of internal concepts that I find really useful personally. And I often do reflect on them in my music.
On his 2021 album Gnosis, Allen expands these themes to explore Greek philosophers. Track titles range from the scientific to mythological to philosophical concepts posited by Aristotle, among others. And while the philosophical influences may not be so self-evident in the sound, musical ones abound, from Klaus Schulze on Entelechy, Emergent Order, to Miles Davis on Lethe, the River of Forgetfulness.
It's sort of a space jazz work, and is probably the most improvisational of the pieces. Both the kind of central voice of the continuum and then the answering voices of the electric piano were recorded very improvisationally. In fact, the electric piano track was done in a single take.
Allen named one of his albums Event Horizon, and he uses that concept as a metaphor for his music overall.
I'm fascinated with boundaries. The event horizon is this place just before you come into this place where the gravitational pull of a singularity takes you who knows where. But there's a very interesting zone that surrounds a singularity. It's the boundary between chaos and order, and I think that's where the really interesting stuff happens.
Interesting stuff happens on Chronotope Project's latest album, Gnosis. It's out on Spotted Peccary Records. I'll have a link for Chronotope Project's Gnosis in the posting for this podcast at echoes.org. You'll also find my review of that album there. As I mentioned, it was the Echoes CD of the month. Every month we pick out our favorite album and send it to members of the Echoes CD of the Month Club. These are super fans of the show who still want great music on CD and want to support the radio show Echoes as well as this podcast. Go to echoes.org to find out more about the Echoes CD of the Month Club. I'm John DiLiberto. See you next week when I talk with Windham Hill founder and guitarist Will Ackerman, horn player Jeff Oster, and keyboardist Tom Eaton about their new collaboration on the album Brothers. This has been the Echoes podcast from PRX. See you next week, tonight on the radio somewhere in the country, or at Echoes Online right now or whenever you want.